All right. Well, hi, this is Dr. Dan Friedman, and he's agreed to talk with you all today a little bit about assessment. And it's fun because I've got history with Dr. Dan Friedman. Worked with him at University 101 at the University of South Carolina in Columbia. And so I'm excited for him to share a little bit about his work with assessment, his role in University 101 programs, and just kind of give you guys some insight from, aside from what you're reading in the texts and in articles and other things. So, but I'm going to let him introduce himself and we'll kind of go from there.
Okay. Well, I don't know what else I would say other than I've been doing first year seminar work for over 20 years, and I've been at the University of South Carolina leading University 101 programs for a little over 11 years. So coupled with that 20 plus year history is my role with assessment, because good program leadership involves an understanding and implementation of regular assessment. So my first job, they asked me, hey, you can do assessment, right? And I was like, sure. And I had to go learn it very quickly. And so this was before Google, where you could just look stuff up very easily. So I had to do a lot of reading and do a lot of conversations and interviews with some really smart people. And over time, figured things out, and now I've written a book on it. So hey, it's you can go from knowing nothing to knowing a little bit more. All it takes is 20 years.
That's great. That's great. Can you sort of shed some light on the capacity of your work? Like when you go forward and start thinking about assessment, how many people are we talking about? Who are you assessing, and what does that look like for your department?
Right. So our department, we're an academic unit that has 6 courses. We have 250 instructors, 250 peer leaders, 30 or 40 campus partners, coupled with a very robust faculty development and curriculum enterprise. So all of those things are in the stew, if you will, when we're talking about assessment. The majority of the assessment that we do is focused on the University 101 course. So course-based assessment, but we're also assessing all of the other aspects and people that we work with, our instructors and our peer leaders and campus partner presentations.
Okay. So is there somebody in your office that sort of heads up assessment? Is that your role? Is that like a designated person? Who sort of coordinates that?
Yeah, so we have a person on our staff who is the assistant director for curriculum and assessment. But it's a little bit of a misnomer because everybody on the team does assessment. So I'm probably, overseeing the major strategy and vision for the assessment, but assessment's everybody's role. I look at some other units that have that's the assessment person, they just handle the assessment. And it seems to me to silo a very important function of one's work. Assessment is not something else that you do. It is part of the process by which you do your work. So very clearly you're saying, here's what we're trying to accomplish. So whether you're planning an event or a course or whatnot, you have to start with, why are we doing this? What are we trying to get out of this? And then on the back end, you have to be at, well, what does success look like? How do we know we're successful? The measurement and the interpretation becomes the assessment, but regardless of whether people actually do assessment or not, they should be asking themselves those questions as they're thinking about their work. So we wouldn't want anybody to just sort of outsource their assessment and say, okay, well, you do it. And the other piece of that is, assessment, there's 2 purposes of assessment, right? When you break it down. You have summative assessment, which is used to make a judgment about the efficacy of a program, right? So does it work? It's an important question, people who pay the bills. It's important to make sure that you're, doing things well, but it's not a very useful question for the second purpose of assessment, which is formative assessment, which is used to improve the program for the future. So knowing whether or not it works only tells you a little bit of the story. Knowing why it works and knowing for whom it works is much more useful. And so we tend to, in our data, not just try to say, okay, 85% of students said that they enjoyed this experience, or 85% of students are now writing at a level that's proficient. I don't know what to do with that information. Even if you had multiple lenses, you have benchmarking, and you've got standards based, and you've got, um, you know, growth over time, it's still not going to tell me what to do with that information. I still don't know if 85% is good, right? But if I know this approach works better than that approach, or it tends to work better for this population, it gives me more information that I can actually do something with. So long answer to your question of it needs to be everybody's responsibility and part of the work that everybody does, not just something that's given to one person.
Okay, and that's great. And a follow-up question to that, do you ever find that you have to motivate people toward an assessment, or are people pretty positive about it? If it's kind of everybody's role in your office, do you find that you have to motivate people toward that?
I have not found that. I mean, I kind of hear that from other places, but I feel like if we've got curious people, because that's really all it is, hey, I'm curious about, blank, you're really just talking about action-based assessment or action research. So as long as you've got curious people on a team, it shouldn't be hard to do, and people who want to do things better. It's not meant to be a sword hanging over somebody's head that says, if you don't hit some metric, then you failed. But how do we then learn, hey, how do we make this better? Because we haven't hit perfection yet, right? And so we keep working towards making things better. I feel like if you're not doing assessment, then you're not being an integral leader, right? You're making assumptions based on what you think is right, or what you think might be working. And that's not fair to the people who you're serving, the people who are paying the bills, if you will. So if you want to operate with integrity, then you really have to be demonstrating that it works and have a full understanding of why it works.
Okay, perfect. So who is your audience when it comes to disseminating the results of your assessment? Are there any key people that really see the work that you all do?
Yeah, and I think it depends on what we are assessing, right? So if you're talking about the summative data, does the program work? We have a couple of audiences. One would be parents and students, right? And we might use that during recruitment to say, hey, students who take University 101 will persist and graduate at significantly higher rates than students that don't take the course. Therefore, you might want to take the course. Those same data are important for our vice president, our president, people who make decisions about funding for the course, and people who can serve as ambassadors and champions for the course. So I make sure that my VP and our AVP know everything that they need to know to represent the program well in whatever meeting that they might be in. And I try to do that in a timely manner, right? So maybe not when it's hot off the press, but maybe right before I know they're going into a Board of Trustees budget meeting, right? So thinking about when does somebody need something, I might do both. I might say, hey, hot off the press, you might want to know this. And then as a reminder, hey, just wanted to share these data again with you when they're probably ready to be hearing that again. Our campus partners, who help us with the curriculum in the course, or another audience, advisors who are advising students into University 101, associate deans who are partnering with us in creating sections of the course. So with our relationship with our College of Business, we have special sections for those students. And those sections have a slightly, not different, but an enhanced focus on a few different areas. One of them is group work, and one of them is on employability. So we're assessing those sections on those outcomes compared to other sections of U101. And then I'll share those data back with the College of Business and say, look, students who are in these sections tend to have higher scores in their ability to work well on a team, and that they've identified and solidified their major and next steps with their career process, because that's what that course was designed to do, right? Then I'm also looking at, are the students just as satisfied and happy, and are they being retained at the same level? Because I don't want one focus of the course that we have for the business sections undermining the other purposes of the class. So it's kind of this delicate balance. And then any other stakeholder that might be related to the research that we're doing. Obviously instructors, I left them out, that's a big group. But with them, it's more the formative side, right? Because great, it's working. What do I do now in the classroom, right? What specifically is working? So when we know that the number one predictor of a student's decision to stay at Carolina as a result of their U101 experience is sense of belonging. Now the instructors know that they can do something. Okay, so I'm going to focus on sense of belonging, and there's a real focal point that can help me improve retention across the board. Or if I know that this particular intervention works better than that intervention. So showing them what's working so we can continually drive formative improvements. We can use the data to identify top performers for a certain learning outcome. Then we go and talk to those instructors and say, what did you do? Why were you so successful at this outcome? And then we write up their approaches. We put it in our faculty resource manual, a 650-page binder with great ideas. We invite them to lead sessions at our faculty development events. So we're replicating best practices across the board. That's how we get better every year.
That's great. Fantastic. Is there a point at which you know that you've sort of saturated your ability to collect this information, to gather the assessment? At what point do you say enough is enough, like we have what we need?
Yeah, I think it depends on the question, right? So if you're saying we're done with assessment, you would never be done with assessment. It's part of the natural planning cycle. But maybe you're like, okay, so for example, I want to know if sections of 101 that have a peer leader, is the experience any different for our U101 students, right? So for 10 years, we assessed that. And we found for 10 years that students who had a peer leader had significantly higher course ratings, were more likely to be retained, had higher GPAs, all of these things. So we're like, okay, well now our policy is that we no longer have sections without a peer leader, right? So we've invested in the peer leader program because we know it works. So we feel pretty good after 10 years, like, okay, this is the story. We may not need to ask that same question again. But maybe I want to know, okay, does it matter if it's a second-year peer leader, like a returning peer leader, versus a brand new peer leader? Or if there's a difference between having a peer leader and a graduate leader, or when the peer leader attends a certain training. So different kinds of questions. So I'm still assessing the peer leader program. I just may have different questions in relation to it.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
So,
and I think, I'm sorry, there's one more thing with that. One of the things that I always say is that good assessment is going to raise more questions than it answers, right? So it's not this proving or definitive kind of mentality where like, okay, this proves this, we're done. But it might be like, but I wonder if this impacts that or that impacts it. And so you kind of it just opens up this thread. It's like, you click on a YouTube video and the next thing you know, you spend 45 minutes watching it's the same thing with assessment. You're just going to go down, and you want to make sure you don't go down the rabbit hole too far, but it's going to, every finding you have will probably raise 5 questions. And so therefore it's hard to ever be done because you never really run out of questions.
That's great. That's great. So here in Pennsylvania, where Messiah is located, we have the Middle States Accrediting Body. And you guys have the Southern Association of Colleges and Schools in the Southeast. So my understanding is that you've worked with those teams to do accreditation visits. Can you talk a little bit about what that looks like? What do you do when you are part of an accreditation visit? And so that students can get a sense of what that's about.
Sure. So I'll talk specifically about the accreditation process and then my role as a lead evaluator for a quality enhancement plan. And I've done that 2 different times, 2 different institution types. But bigger picture, with the accreditation process, the first step is that institutions are doing sort of a self-report, right? They're putting together a lot of information per the guidelines of that accrediting body. And then they will send it off to that accrediting body. And there will be a team of external reviewers that will review all of the standards. So we've got, 100 standards, something like that. And we're each institution has to make a case as to their accomplishments related to that, the satisfaction of the standards. The off-campus team reviews it, creates a report. The institution has a chance to then respond. Then there's an on-site visit, and the on-site committee will come in, and that's a different group of people than the off-site. And any sort of thing that's hanging out there, like there are 7 concerns that were not resolved prior to the visit, the time is spent during that visit asking questions, getting more information, drilling down into those specific issues. It's fun because you get to meet with a whole host of interesting people on those campuses, and everyone's always on the best behavior and high alert. It's a very nerve-inducing kind of experience for people who are on the other side of the table and have been on that side of the table. But there really is no need for that. If you're running your institution the right way, then it really is very helpful to have somebody else come in and say, this looks like it might be an issue, explain this. And you're really just, explaining what's happening. Or somebody may catch something like, oh yeah, we didn't see that. That's a really good call. We need to have a policy in place for that. Or whatever it is that strengthens the overall educational experience for our students. Part of that is, so the on-site committee will create a report. They'll do on the last day, they'll say, here's what to expect. Hopefully the institution doesn't get any recommendations. That sounds like a very nice word, but at least in the Southern Association, that's a pretty bad thing to get a recommendation. It means that something didn't go well. So then every December at the association meeting and for the Southern Association, the board gets together to basically vote and approve on the accreditation. That's when everything is announced, December of every year, regardless of when the visit is. In the Southern Association, we have an extra component called a quality enhancement plan. And this is designed for institutions to identify a piece of work that might need to be, that they want to focus on to improve the overall experience at the institution. It could range from creating a first-year experience to integrative learning to, a host of different things. So my role has been both related to a first-year experience or a first-year seminar. And they bring somebody in who's an expert in that area to sort of give them advice, recommendations, et cetera, in a good way, for how to strengthen the plan. So what we're reacting to, I've got the steps here. So we have to respond to, is the plan acceptable? So was there an institutional process for identifying the key issues? And that emerged from assessment. So the assessment on the front end was saying, hey, this is an area of need for your institution. We have to respond to the focus of the plan. Does it focus on learning outcomes and supporting student learning? And will it accomplish the mission of the institution? Another one is, does the institution have the capability for completing the plan? Have they dedicated enough resources for it? Is there evidence that they can actually do this? Is it feasible? Is there a broad-based involvement of constituents? Does it spread across the institution? And then the last one is there an assessment plan that makes sense to measure that? So assessment is on the front end and on the back end of a good quality enhancement plan.
Very good. So, and then is that funded through the college or university that enacts that plan, or where did the funds come to sort of?
Yeah, the institution has to carve it out from somewhere.
Okay.
So if they're saying we're going to devote $1 million a year, they're going to have, that $1 million has got to come from somewhere.
Okay.
And so, yeah, it just depends on, and the ones that I'm looking at where it's much smaller schools, so you're not talking that kind of money at all.
Sure. Okay. What are the biggest mistakes that departments or institutions make when it comes to assessment?
I think there's a couple. I think trying to do too much, trying to assess everything all at the same time, and then you can't make sense of anything. You're overwhelmed with the process, and so I think picking a few key things and questions that you have for each area of the work that you do is probably a smart way to approach it. I think they underestimate the difficulty of interpreting the data. So you think about an assessment cycle, right? You identify your outcomes, and then you figure out how you will measure that. You'll collect your data, and then you're going to interpret the findings. Everyone sort of they want to focus on that measurement piece. How are we going to measure it? Without giving more thought to, okay, so let's say I get all these information. What am I going to do with it? So I think playing out some hypotheticals as you're developing survey instruments or developing an assessment plan, what would I do with this information if I found blank? and even throwing a different set of numbers, then they help you realize, oh yeah, even if I get this information, it's really not going to be that helpful because I don't know what I would do with it. So I think having really good research questions aligned with your assessment process will help focus it, and then give you a sense of how you might interpret the data a little better, and then what you might do with it. I think implementing it. I think some people are a little too quick to act on poor assessment data. So if you see something that says, oh, well, we found that students didn't like this, so we're going to stop doing it, versus, well, maybe we just need to do it better. Or we need to train the people who are doing it to do it better. Or maybe we find something that, classic example, right? So we had a graduate student a couple years ago, 2 years ago, who was really interested in the impact of Windows on a learning environment. And so she wanted to know, do classrooms who have a window have higher class evaluation scores than sections that are in buildings or rooms without a window, right? And so we found that there is a difference between sections that have a window and those that don't, right? So now what do I do with that information, right? So do I have to work with the registrar to make sure we only put sections in rooms with windows? So you drill down and you start controlling for other variables, right? So you have to ask, well, what else could be at play here? Because just because two things are correlated doesn't mean that one thing causes the other, right?
Right.
So maybe there's another variable hidden out here that's really the one that's driving it. So it turns out it's not so much the impact of a window, it's the fact that the way we do our scheduling is our returning instructors we're putting on the schedule first, and the buildings that we control tend to be a little bit nicer. And so I'm putting them in those rooms first. And anybody who goes through, let's say, our March training or our May training, a new instructor who's coming later in the game are probably getting whatever is left over classroom-wise. And so the impact isn't necessarily that it's a classroom with a window, it's that there's an instructor who's teaching for the first time. Okay, so that's why you can't outsource assessment, is because context is so important when you're interpreting the data. Just because you see and the one that my biggest pet peeve is you'll see students who do this have this score and students who, don't do this have this score, but you're not really talking about any sort of control on the front end for how they may be similar or different. The impact of pre-enrollment biases, self-selection bias, or any of those things, or the fact that you're talking about there's 5,000 students in this category and there were 20 in this one, right? So I think poor assessment through poor understanding of statistics. And I don't want to scare people into saying you have to be an expert in statistics, but if you could find a friend who's really good at it, that could really help you out down the road.
Very good, very good. Anything that you would say that departments or institutions do particularly well when it comes to assessment?
Yeah, I think those institutions that are departments that measure what matters, right? That rather than trying to do everything, picking a few really important things that, it would be nice to do this. Okay, well, does it really matter for the work that we're doing? I think they're applying the findings for formative improvement. So they're saying, okay, this approach works better than that approach, or even, this person seems to be doing this thing really well, and they go find out what they're doing, rather than just saying 85% of our students are satisfied. Okay, so what, right? Where are they satisfied? Where are they not satisfied? By which section, by which intervention, and really drilling down. So they're disaggregating the findings. Maybe that, you're seeing that students who participate in your program have higher scores, but maybe even drilling that further down. Does it matter if they're a first-generation student, a minority student, a Pell Grant recipient, lower academic ability? And maybe you'll find different stories to tell, which will then lead you, obviously, to different things that you can do. Institutions or departments that use multiple measures. So rather than just saying, we met our standard, maybe show me longitudinal. Are you getting better over time? Or how does this compare to your peer group? Or take a snapshot of how they were when they walked in the door, and then how they are at the end of your experience. So that's value-added assessment. So multiple lenses will really help you kind of crystallize in on understanding and interpreting your data. Communicating the results widely and fairly and accurately and timely, I think, will be important. And then there's this acknowledgement that there's no perfect assessment plan. I think a lot of folks will like, it's not perfect yet, we're not ready to do it. Well, if you wait till it's perfect, you'll never do it, because there's no such thing as the perfect assessment plan, particularly when it comes to the work that we do in educational research, which is really a derivative of social science research, which is you're dealing with humans, so it's going to be complicated and flawed. And you're dealing with inferential statistics, meaning that the best you can do is make an inference from the data about the efficacy of the program. You're never going to definitively prove anything. So making sure they're not using those wordings.
Perfect. What advice would you give to a graduate student who's job searching and wants to make sure that the campus that they're looking at has good assessment efforts?
That's a good question. I think looking online first, doing your homework on the front end, seeing what's put out there, instruments that they might be using, but just because they're using an instrument doesn't mean they're using it well, right? So I think when it comes down to the on-campus interview, and the most important piece are the questions you ask. I think asking questions such as, what improvements have you made in the last few years as a result of your assessment findings, I think will help you. It shows that yes, they are or not doing assessment. And then the most important piece, they're applying that information. So if they have a hard time answering that question, that may be a tip that there's not a lot going on there, which may not be something that is a deal breaker. It just may give you an opportunity in that position to really show off your skill set and make a big difference. Because once you have that skill set, people will start looking to you, and you will have much more credibility and staying power on campus.
Fantastic. Very good. Well, thank you so much. This is extremely helpful, and I know the students will really appreciate being to hear the perspectives of somebody who really understands what assessment is about and actually uses it, to improve your department. So that's really helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, well, I appreciate the opportunity, and I hope you get excited about assessment because it is the most fun part of any work that we do. It's not an add-on, and it's just a natural process by which we should go about our everyday work.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. Y'all take care.